This is East by West, written by Beryl Coops.
East by West. The old wooden hull of the Windward creaked as it settled against the dock, a small animal adjusting its bones. The boat rocked in time with the tide as though even it were hesitating, unsure of the journey ahead and the weight it had been asked to carry. Michael stood with one hand resting on the weather-worn mast, his palm moving slowly, reading the rises and cuts in the grain like braille. There were old scars in the wood, a gouge from a clumsy docking in '98, a burn the size of a coin where his father had once rested a cigarette for just a moment, a hairline crack that ran like a wrinkle. The mast had belonged to his father, and so had the boat, though in truth the Windward had been more of a companion to the old man than Michael had ever managed to be. Morning pressed down cold and wet, the kind of grey dampness that seeped through sleeves and cuffs and settled in the chest with the quiet insistence of grief. The harbour was mostly still at that hour. A halyard tapped absently against aluminum somewhere down the row, water lapped at soaked pylons, a gull cried like it had forgotten where the ocean was. Diesel hung in the air from a fishing boat that had already gone and returned, leaving a spine of wake that never quite reached the marina. Michael found the solitude comforting, or perhaps not comforting so much as honest. Emptiness didn't lie. In his pocket sat a folded tide chart and an old photograph. The box of his father's ashes was in his pack, heavier than its size allowed, as if it were a book written in a language he was never taught. He had not opened it. He didn't think he could. Sometimes when his hand brushed the pack, he imagined he could feel a pulse. Rationally, he knew better. Grief was a little irrational on purpose. Still floating, a voice crackled behind him, rough at the edges, familiar enough to loosen something in his chest. "You're braver than me." Michael turned. Bill, the dockmaster, broad-shouldered, windproof, eyes like tired oysters behind salt-crusted lashes, stood holding out a thermos, half greeting, half apology. The knuckles on Bill's hands were cut and polished by rope burn. He was a man who had made peace with calluses long ago. "Coffee?" Bill kept his voice low, as if volume might disturb the boat's balance. Michael took the thermos and the heat of it bit sweetly into his cold palms. "Thanks." Bill didn't leave. He glanced at the mast, at the patched jib, at Michael's face. "You really sailing out today? Weather's turning strange. Winds are all wrong." He shifted his weight. "Barometer fell hard around 4. You feel it, don't you? That heaviness?" Michael looked toward the horizon, where the sky sagged over the ocean like a wet sheet. The line between water and cloud had been smudged away by mist, so the world looked unfinished. It's what he wanted. Bill's eyes dropped to the canvas pack at Michael's shoulder, to the squared shape resting inside. "Aye," he murmured. "Guess we all leave unfinished business." He paused, thumb worrying at a split in the thermos's paint. "He taught me a verse for that knot, you know. The rabbit comes out the hole. Goes round the tree and back in the hole," Michael finished before he could stop himself. The words arrived like muscle memory. For a moment he could see his father's brown, oil-flecked hands guiding his smaller ones, the rope scratching his wrists, the smell of creosote and tobacco thick in the shed. He swallowed. He liked things that stayed put. Not everything does. Bill's gaze lifted and softened. "You'll be careful." "I'll try," Michael said. It was the closest thing to a promise he trusted. They stood in shared quiet for a moment, two men not quite looking at each other. A breeze moved through the rigging and turned the marina into a loose choir of metal and cord. Somewhere a roller shutter groaned open. The day was beginning in the practical way days do, indifferent to what it carried. Michael climbed aboard with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had rehearsed them to stave off panic. He coiled the mooring lines. Port first, always port first, because his father had once barked that order at him so loudly it had lodged like a splinter, and let them fall into the cockpit like unspooling memories. He checked the bilge, flicked the radio on and off just to hear its small, obedient crackle, and ran his thumb along a tear in the mainsail he'd mended the winter before the diagnosis. The mend had held. Not everything did. "Fair tide," Bill called, stepping back. He didn't say good luck. Sailors had their own grammar for hope. Michael nodded and, with a push of his boot against the piling, eased the Windward out into water that accepted the hull the way a palm accepts a familiar weight. He kept his eyes forward as the dock slid away and the marina narrowed behind him like a throat. He did not look back. Looking back made oceans longer. The first day passed quietly, as if the sea were feeling him out. The boat groaned and complained the way old boats do, each noise a kind of language he half understood. It obeyed. Wind shouldered the sail with a steady pressure that felt almost courteous. Michael kept to work. He ate from a tin of beans with the stubborn concentration of a man doing penance, drank little, let the rum sit untouched beside the stove like a dangerous suggestion. In the cuddy, a neat row. Water, flares, spare line, the old oilskin with the split seam he'd never found time to stitch. There was comfort in the arrangement of useful things. Folded and crumpled in his coat pocket, the map that had once hung above his father's fireplace rode along with him. He had taken it down after the funeral, fingers slipping under brittle tape, an act as intimate and as clumsy as undressing a body. He'd meant only to borrow it. He'd meant so many temporary things that had become permanent. It had always struck him as odd, how a man who could barely string two soft words together without a grumble could spend hours tracing invisible lines across paper, his forefinger dragging from headland to headland, as if he were reading the ocean's private veins. When Michael was small, he would lie on the rug and watch the finger move, try to guess what the lines stood for. "Always east, boy," his father used to mutter, not unkindly, not kindly either, just as a fact he believed. East brings the day, east brings light. And then he'd cough, and the map would shiver, and the cigarette would ash itself into a saucer dark with the ghosts of other cigarettes. The memory did not warm him. It tightened something instead. There had been so many of those half-lessons, those tossed-out aphorisms like bread to a bird he never quite fed. When it had mattered at the end, it had all gone quiet. The hospital room had smelled of bleach and defeat. Machines blinked in small, smug rhythms. His father's chest rose and fell with a sound like tide under a pier. Michael had stood at the foot of the bed, the way a boy stands at the end of a diving board, wondering if he is meant to jump or be pushed. He had waited for something to be handed to him, a truth, an apology, a scrap of whatever fathers are supposed to give sons that makes the rest of it make sense. He had watched the mouth move once, had bent close enough to feel the faint warmth of that old tobacco-scarred breath against his cheek. A whisper had crossed the short distance between them and then unravelled on his skin. Afterward, when the nurse placed the small wooden box in his hands, light, shockingly light, he had felt a flare of anger so sharp it left the edges of his vision clean. This, then, was what was left. This, and a map and the echo of a sentence he might have misheard. Now, alone on the water with grey on all sides and a wind that pressed rather than shoved, Michael let the Windward hold a line he could name. He ate another mouthful of beans. He wiped the spoon on his jeans. He took the photograph from his pocket and rested it on his knee. In the faded picture his father stood at the stern of the Windward, younger by decades, hair blown back, eyes narrowed not in laughter but in weather. A small boy, Michael at 7, sat on the deck with a coil of rope in his lap, his face turned up, waiting for instruction that would arrive in the shape of a knot rather than a kindness. In the very corner of the photo, a fingertip, his mother's maybe, intruded, as if some softer presence had tried to make room for itself and been cut off by the edge of the frame. He slid the photograph away before it could do more damage. The horizon stayed where it was. The boat shouldered forward, the day darkened by degrees, a dimmer switch turning down. Michael tightened his grip on the tiller until the bones in his hand showed pale under the skin. "All right," he said into the wind that didn't care. "East, then." It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't even agreement. It was the simple, stubborn beginning of a promise he did not yet know how to keep. On the second day, the storm came. It did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way a lie does, soft at first, plausible. A furred hush moved over the water, the wind dropped as if sucking in a breath, and the light went odd, tinny around the edges. The hairs along Michael's forearms lifted before the clouds showed their true shape. He had sailed long enough to read the sea's moods, and this one had turned its face away. He reefed early. Habit and his father's voice. Shorten sail before you wish you had. By the time he hauled the clue down and made it fast, the world had narrowed to rope burn and breath. He'd just got the main bundled and lashed when the first gust shouldered him. Rain came at an angle, a hard slap of cold that stung like thrown gravel. Static crawled through the rigging. Lightning stitched a white seam straight across the sky and left the taste of metal on his tongue. Thunder opened a rib in the afternoon and climbed inside. He clipped his harness to the jackline and kept the Windward's nose as close to the wind as the breaking seas allowed. The boat climbed dark backs of water and slid into troughs that felt bottomless. Each rise was a decision, each fall a consequence. Spray emptied into the cockpit in fistfuls. The boom snatched once, and he caught it with both hands, and the kind of panic that looks like competence from far away. The sea did not care. It heaved and shouldered, and every few minutes chose a different rule. The hull shuddered. The tiller kicked like a live thing. Michael's jaw ached from clenching. He thought, not for the first time, that control is the story we tell ourselves when we are afraid of the dark. Easy, he said to the boat, to himself, to a father who had always preferred weather to explanation. He scanned the stripped horizon and saw only grey stacked on grey, a smeared pencil line where the world was supposed to end. Another gust, harder. The rain thickened, bands on a drum. He felt the barometers drop in his bones the way old men feel rain in their knees. A wall of water rose ahead, and he had that flicker of thought, too tall, an instant before it broke. The wave hit square over the bow, a cold, violent tackle that ripped breath and balance at once. He went sideways, hard into the combing, his shoulder lit with pain. Hands went blind, the tether went tight. The world turned white, then black, then thinner than both. Darkness, a moment only, cold, wet, blinding, and then nothing at all. When he returned, the world had changed its mind. Silence held the air open, not the thick quiet after thunder, but a gentle, unashamed stillness that belonged to a place where storms were a story already told. He lay where he was and listened. No rigging sang, no hull slammed. Somewhere nearby, a bird called in a rhythm that sounded like someone teaching a child to whistle. He opened his eyes into light. The sky above him was a clean blue rinsed to its edges. The air smelled different, sweet, green, a little like flowers crushed between pages and a little like warm rain drying on stone. His head throbbed with the measured insistence of a bruise. His tongue tasted of salt and copper. He pushed himself upright. The Windward lay beached on a slope of pale sand, canted slightly as if listening. The keel had carved a faint scar down to the place she'd come to rest, high enough that the small regular hiss of the shore break could not reach her. Tall palms leaned as if mid-conversation. The sea beyond glittered with an almost indecent innocence. "Hey!" he said to the boat, ridiculous and grateful. "Hey!" The cobweb of pain in his shoulder held, but his legs answered when he asked them to. He took stock the way his father taught him when he was 10, and panicking over a lost oar. Name what is, not what you fear. The main was torn along the leech. The jib's luff had popped a seam. A locker had vomited its contents across the cockpit. Flares, a sodden paperback with its spine softened into velvet, a tin of beans making slow circles in a puddle. The mast stood. The hull looked whole. He ducked into the cabin, swallowing the small animal panic that still lived under his breastbone, and there, wedged beneath the companionway steps exactly where he'd lashed it, was his pack. He touched it first, before anything else, palms flat as if checking a sleeping child. The canvas was damp, not soaked. Inside, a dry bag. Inside the dry bag, the box of his father's ashes. He set the pack carefully on the berth and sat with it for a long breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding since the wave had made its choice. Only when the breath rolled out did his shoulders drop. A part of him had been braced to find that square absence, the negative space a lost thing prints on the world. The relief made him a little light-headed. He laughed once, a shaky, unhandsome sound, and immediately wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand as if seawater could be embarrassed. "Still here," he whispered, to the box that could not answer, and to the man who never quite had. Outside, sunlight moved in coins across the deck. A small shore crab investigated the shadow under the rudder with professional curiosity. The world had the washed clarity of a day after crying. He eased himself over the gunwale and slipped down into sand that received his weight without argument. The beach arced in both directions until it turned back into forest. No houses, no jetty, no power lines scribbling the sky, only green, dense and intent where the trees met the day. The kind of place that did not need to be found to prove it existed. Footprints marked the wet part of the sand, his, messy and staggered from where he had tumbled out, a scatter of bird tracks, the curled hieroglyph of a crab's passing. Nothing else. He listened for the mechanical heartbeats of civilization and heard only water and leaves making their small exchange of secrets. A narrow path revealed itself where the beach lifted into shade. A slight break in the ferns, vines trained aside by a patience he could feel but not yet name. It did not look dramatic. It looked like an invitation spoken by someone who hates to be overheard. He should have started with the sail. He should have inventoried damage, checked the keel, rigged a jury stay, done the sensible litany of repairs his father's lessons had wired into his hands. Instead, he went back aboard and shouldered his pack, feeling the familiar square press between his shoulder blades, an anchor of a different kind. He tightened the strap across his chest and winced when his bruised shoulder objected. He took one last look at the Windward, at the way she rested like a tired animal trusting the sand. "Don't go anywhere," he said, and smiled despite himself. He stepped into the shade. Heat pooled under the canopy. Sunlight fell in dapples, slow and generous, as if poured through a sieve. The air changed temperature by degrees as he walked, cooler near the deep green, warmer where a gap let the sky in. Leaves brushed his sleeves. Somewhere above, something chittered. The earth underfoot was springy, with years of fallen things returning to themselves. He moved more carefully than the path required, not from fear of snakes or roots, but from the sudden absurd sense that he was trespassing on someone else's memory. He hesitated when the path bent. Then he followed it. The path curved gently through the dense trees, not in a way that felt accidental, but with the quiet confidence of something that had been walked before. It threaded between buttressed roots and low ferns, with a patience that made Michael slow without meaning to. The air was thick with heat. It clung to him like a damp shirt and turned each breath into something he had to lift. Above, the canopy sifted sunlight into slow, dappled waves that crossed his shoulders and packed as if the forest were counting him in and out of shadow. His boots sank slightly into the moss-soft earth. Each step pressed a quiet signature that rose back up when he lifted his heel, as though the ground were reluctant to let him go. The strangeness of it seeped deeper with every footfall, the way unfamiliar places do not shout, but hum, until you realize the note has pitched itself inside your chest. He was somewhere he hadn't meant to be. The map in his pocket felt ridiculous now, edges soggy, route irrelevant. East had been the plan. East was the sentence he'd carried like a compass, his father's words, the map's lines, the promise in his pack. But he was here, not east, not even close. The strap across his chest creaked as he adjusted it, the square weight of the box at his back grounding him more than any chart ever had. The scent reached him first, wood smoke and something sweet, like honey slipping over warm bread. It didn't belong to the wild. It belonged to a kitchen, to a hand. Someone was cooking. He paused, listening. The island had a way of making sound come from everywhere at once. The pop of sap in a fire, a bird working through a four-note call, the hush of leaves exchanging gossip overhead. The path, which until then had been suggestion, decided itself into certainty and made a small, courteous bend to the left. A turn opened onto a clearing, and there she was. An old woman sat on a worn wooden stool beside a hut assembled from driftwood and palm fronds, each piece of timber fitting another in the practical poetry of use. The roof dipped slightly where some storm had once pressed its thumb. A line of shells hung in the doorway, clicking together like gentle bones. She had a metal pot balanced over a low fire. Her hands moved with the idle competence of someone who had long since stopped rushing anything, shelling pale beans that landed with small domestic thuds. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You're not from the island?" Michael froze at the edge of the clearing, all the wild edges of the storm suddenly sharpening into the simple sharpness of being seen. He wasn't sure whether to answer or step backward into the green until the path forgot him. "No," he managed. his voice dry and unpracticed. I got blown off course. Now she lifted her gaze. Her face was lined like an old chart, creases that had once been rivers now cut as valleys, a scattering of freckles like soundings, a faint scar that could have been a coastline you only notice when the tide is out. Her eyes, sharp and oddly familiar, narrowed against the light. Strands of grey hair escaped their knot and moved in the breeze like smoke. "Well," she said, setting the pot aside with a soft scrape, "you're here now." There was no judgment in it, only the mild acceptance of a tide coming in when it comes in. Up close he saw that her hands were sailors' hands. Rope had educated those knuckles, knives had left honest nicks. She tilted her head toward a low plank that had learned to be a bench. Sit, if sitting's what you need. Michael moved forward as if approaching a wary animal. He slid the pack off his shoulder with care he could not disguise, setting it at his feet and keeping one hand on the strap. The relief of its weight leaving his back was immediate and disloyal. He missed it as soon as it was gone. She watched the gesture and, with the smallest nod, pretended not to. "Water?" she asked, already reaching for a tin cup. A bucket stood in the shade, covered with a cloth. The water was cool, the kind that tastes of metal and stone and patience. He drank too quickly, coughed, and she smiled without letting the smile reach her mouth. "Thank you," he said. "Isadora," she offered, as if names were something to be put on the table early so conversation didn't have to trip over them later. "You? Michael?" She stirred the pot with a stick that had earned its place as a spoon. The stew released a warm, complicated breath, earth and salt and something citrus he couldn't name. "Storm put you there," she said, flicking her chin in the vague direction of the sea, "or you put yourself there and called it a storm." He almost laughed. It came out as a small exhale. "A bit of both, maybe. Most things are." She tasted the stew, then tossed a pinch of something into the pot from between her fingers, measuring by memory. A kettle sat near the coals, dented and proud. A length of line hung coiled from a nail. The coil was tidy in the way that means habit rather than show. He let his eyes travel, grateful for the work of looking. The hut's walls were patched with bits of boat, a slat with flaking blue paint, a section of rail rubbed smooth by hands, a cracked oar blade that had found a second life as a shelf. On it sat a knife with a wrapped handle, a small bottle of amber liquid, a lump of beeswax, and a smooth stone thumb-polished. The place was not poor. It was edited. "Hungry?" she asked, not quite turning to face him, as if the question were a courtesy she expected him to accept. He hadn't noticed until that moment how empty he felt. "Yes," he said, and his stomach stepped forward before the rest of him. She handed him a shallow wooden bowl, the kind that had been used so often it had learned to be warm, even when empty. The stew tasted like the island itself, earthy, strange and comforting, a sweetness threaded through it that did not announce itself so much as wait to be found. He ate with the attention of a man shocked by kindness. They sat in a quiet that didn't need to be fixed. Every so often the shells at the door chimed, not from wind but from the air deciding to move. Somewhere beyond the clearing a gecko clicked like a loose bead. He could feel the day leaning toward evening. "Where were you going?" she asked at last, "when you were going where you weren't?" He stared into the slow spiral of his bowl before answering. "East," he said. "My father, he asked me to go east." He stopped, surprised by the way the word father made his throat feel crowded. "Did he?" she said, as if he'd told her the time, and they let the statement sit between them. No questions, no prodding at the wound to see if it still bled. She simply observed him, the way one watches the tide decide how far it intends to come. She didn't hurry the evening. She let it arrive. As the light lowered, the clearing softened. The green around them deepened into shades that the day had been too busy to show. She stoked the fire with a small, efficient hand. He helped without being asked, brought a few fallen sticks, checked the pot leg when it wobbled, shifted his pack out of the way of a roving ember. Each small task steadied him in a way the horizon had not. "Storm will have torn something," she said after a while, not looking at him. "Sails don't love temper. You'll mend in the morning. Tonight you'll eat and sit and remember how to be a person." He nodded. The simplicity of the program felt like mercy. When darkness finally gathered itself under the trees, she produced a bottle from the shelf, a modest thing with no label and a cork that had been worked at many times, and poured a little into 2 chipped cups. "For the ache behind the ache," she said, "for the weather inside the weather." The drink was sharp and amber and honest. It made a low path of warmth through him and left a small, clean fire in its wake. She asked no questions and offered no apologies for her silence. She didn't need his story to prove she'd survived her own. She simply sat, a presence like the steady glow of coals, enough heat to lean toward, enough light to see your hands by. And in the space that opened, between the shells clinking and the beans cooling and the night learning his name, Michael felt, for the first time in months, that he was not being measured against the man he had failed to be, but simply being allowed to be the man he was, here, on an island that had not asked for him and had made room anyway. Michael had always expected that if he ever ended up stranded somewhere, it would be a lonely kind of silence. But there was nothing lonely about Isadora. She didn't fill the air with chatter, nor did she leave it empty. She let the evening breathe, the way a good sailor lets a sail take its own shape. "So," she said at last, not to pry, more like turning a chart to the light, "what were you chasing east?" He stared into the fire. The flames licked the blackened pot and wrote their brief, unreadable letters across the metal. Smoke drifted up and took its time deciding where to go. "My father," he said, almost a whisper. "He died. Wanted his ashes scattered. He said to go east." Isadora did not move. Her eyes held his the way a lighthouse holds a wavering beam, steady, without insistence. "He ever tell you why east?" Michael shook his head. The strap of his pack pressed against his shoulder. He became aware of its square weight at his back, the way you become aware of an ache you've been ignoring. "He didn't tell me much of anything, not when it mattered." Crickets stitched their thread through the margin of the clearing. Shells at the doorway chimed once, twice, like someone quietly agreeing. Isadora reached behind her into a wooden crate and drew out a bundle wrapped in wax paper and twine. The paper had been handled often. The corners had learned to fold along the same creases. "He once told me," she said, setting the bundle between them, "that east reminded him of beginnings, of when things felt new." Michael's chest tightened, a small fist closing. "You knew him?" Isadora's mouth creased into something that might have been a smile and might have been a wince. "Knew of him," she said. "A long time ago. He came through here, or near enough, back when we both had fewer regrets and better knees." He reached forward and worried the knot loose with slow, clumsy fingers. The twine resisted, then gave. Inside, a map, hand-drawn, faded to the colour of old tea, the ink curled at the edges where salt and time had conspired. He did not need more than a glance to know the handwriting. It lived in him. The long, impatient downstrokes, the way his father crowded letters into a harbour at the end of a line, the small habitual ink flare where he'd lift the pen from an tea. His breath left him like a wave going slack. On the bottom edge, beneath a string of longitudes and a coastline he could not place, a note in that same hard, familiar hand, east by west. He touched the words with a fingertip, as if heat might rise from them. He had seen that phrase before, in the margin of the fireplace map, on a scrap pinned to the shed wall, muttered under breath when his father thought he was alone. It had sounded like a riddle then, or a joke he wasn't old enough to get. "He always said that," Michael murmured. "I never understood." Isadora watched the way his thumb hovered over the ink. "On a compass," she said, "east sits here." She drew a small circle in the dust with a stick. "And west sits here. The truth of a straight line makes men feel brave." She tapped the map. "But the sea doesn't love straight lines. You want east and she gives you headwind, so you tack. You fall off a little, then you come back to it. Sometimes you even bear away, west a spell, to find wind that will carry you where east alone won't." She lifted her eyes. "Doesn't mean you're wrong. Means you're going the way that works." Michael swallowed. All at once he was 7 again, on the saloon floor, watching the long finger trace from headland to headland while the cigarette burned itself down in a saucer. He had mistaken that stern silence for absence. Now, looking at the cramped handwriting, he wondered if the man had been trying, in the only language he trusted, to teach him how to live. He held the map higher. The firelight travelled the coastline and found small notations tucked into coves. A cross here, a dotted line there, a word nearly lost to fading. Safe. He let the word strike him where it wanted. "Why do you have this?" he asked quietly. Isadora's gaze slid toward the sea and back. He traded for water and a jar of honey one season. Left that paper with a promise to return it on his way back. A beat. Not all promises find their weather. She reached for the bottle, poured the smallest finger into each cup and raised hers without ceremony. "To beginnings," she said, and then softer, "and to the long way around." They drank. The heat made a path through Michael's chest and left him raw in a clean way. He kept the map on his knees, afraid that if he set it down it would turn back into paper. "East by west," he said again, testing the shape of it, letting the paradox sit on his tongue until it tasted less like error and more like instruction. Isadora leaned forward and, with her stick, drew a zigzag across the circle she'd sketched. "We make for a point by not pointing at it," she said. "It's the only way some places let you in." He nodded. The fire worked quietly. Beyond the clearing, the night went about its business. Somewhere in the dark, a fruit fell, soft as a sigh. Michael folded the map along its old scars and slid it back into the wax paper, his hands careful in a way he had never been with anything of his father's when the man was alive. He set the bundle near his pack and let his palm rest there over both. He did not know yet what the phrase would ask of him, only that it had stopped being a riddle and started being a route. Isadora settled her shoulders, the work of the day finally leaving them. "You'll mend the sail at first light," she said, as if it were the end of a prayer. "Eat now, sleep. The tide's on your side in the morning." He looked up, gratitude rising in him with a sting that surprised him. "Thank you," he said, and what he meant was more sprawling, more clumsy. "For the map, for not asking, for making room." Isadora gave a small approving nod. "East brings the day," she said, almost to herself. "But sometimes the night is where you find your way." They spent the next 2 days working side by side to mend the boat. Mornings were for canvas and line, afternoons for wood and quiet. Isadora's hands knew rope like a second language, how to belly the stitch so the sail would flex and not tear again, how to coax a splintered batten back into usefulness with resin and patience. She didn't explain how she knew any of it. She didn't explain much at all. When Michael pulled a seam too tight, she only tapped his knuckles, not unkindly. "Let the cloth remember its shape," she said. "Don't ask it to be something it isn't." They fell into an easy grammar of work. He scraped salt from fittings. She melted beeswax and rubbed it along tired thread until it shone. He spliced a frayed halyard under her eye and unlearned an old, ugly habit of rushing the last inch. In the shade he planed a split from the tiller, counting curls of wood like breaths. Between tasks, she would sit on the step of the hut and watch the water change its mind, and he would sit beside her, the square weight of his pack against his calf, anchor enough. On the second evening, while sorting sailcloth on the sand, Michael unrolled the hand-drawn map across a plank and held it flat with seashells. In the angled light, a small notation on the coastline, a dogleg reef, a stream mouth, 2 marks like leaning palms, woke in his memory. He lifted his head to the cove and felt the prickle of recognition run along his arms. Safe, his father had written there in his hurried hand. The word had almost vanished to time. It was this place. He didn't say it aloud. He only touched the faded ink and then the air, as if introducing the two. Something in him loosened and hurt at once. At night they sat beneath the stars, sharing a slow bottle of something sharp and amber that Isadora swore helped with the soul. Michael didn't argue. The drink drew a small, clean line of heat through him and left honesty where it passed. The shells in the doorway chimed when the breeze remembered them. Somewhere a gecko clicked like a metronome learning patience. On the third evening he brought the box from his pack, his father's ashes. He held it in his lap a long while, listening to the surf yoke itself and slip free beyond the tree line. The grain of the box had darkened where his palms had learned it. "I think," he said, slow and unsure, "he wanted me to let go of something. Not just him. Maybe a version of him I never got to meet." Isadora nodded, her voice a low thread. "We carry people in pieces," she said. "Sometimes we need to break them open to see the whole." He stood, the box in both hands, and walked barefoot down to the water. The sand was cool. It gave under his weight and came back. The first wash of the sea around his calves felt like his body remembering a language it had spoken as a child. He waded until the gentle push and pull steadied him. He opened the box. Ash rose and took the wind like mist, lifted in a pale, shimmering plume and drifted into the moonlight. Some of it caught on his wrists and left a soft, stubborn grey that the water did not immediately take. He let the waves do their quiet work. He didn't speak. There were no true words for this, only the hush of the shore, the breath of the island, and that sound inside him, old and loud and always humming, finally going quiet. On the way back up the beach, he paused and, without thinking, tied the loose end of the shell line at Isadora's door into a neat bowline, the rabbit out of the hole, around the tree, and back again. The knot sat there, simple, tidy, true, and Michael felt something circle and close. They finished the last of the mending the following day. The Windward stood ready in the morning light, patched and humble and somehow handsomer for it. Isadora checked each repair the way a captain checks weather, without fuss, leaving nothing to hope. When he reached for the map to hand it back, she touched his wrist and slid the bundle already wrapped into his pack. "Keep it," she said. "Not all promises find their weather. Let this one have a chance." He swallowed. "I don't know how to repay you." "You just did," she said, glancing toward the cove where the word safe had almost disappeared. "You put a man back where he meant to be." 3 days after the storm, he pushed off. The Windward held straight by freshened lines, and the memory of good hands leaned into the small wind like a creature eager to try itself. Michael set a course and watched the island shrink to a green thumbprint. Isadora stood at the shore with her hands in her pockets, her shoulders easy. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Some goodbyes know better than to spend themselves on the air. As the boat reached open water, the swell lifted her and set her down again, a measured, forgiving motion. Michael laid the map on his knee and traced without looking, the way he remembered his father doing, headland to headland, a neat tack drawn not toward a point but toward the wind that would carry him. The compass card read W. The sky ahead brightened anyway. When he looked back one last time, only smoke from a small fire stitched itself into the blue above the trees, thin and certain. He thought of the word on the map. He thought of the knot at the door. He thought of the man who had taught him to make a loop that would hold, and of the woman who had shown him how to loosen what needed loosening. "When you miss him," Isadora had said before he boarded, her voice so light he almost missed it. "Tack." He smiled at nothing in particular and set his hand firm on the tiller. He steered her west, not because he was lost, but because he knew now that meaning didn't live on any single line. East by west, the long way that works. Behind him, the island thinned into memory. Before him, the sea made room. He didn't know where he'd go next, but he knew this much. Some journeys don't begin until you've gone completely off course, and some fathers don't come home until you carry them there yourself.
This was East by West, written by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.